For now, though, let's tell you about this. ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula says the governing party will assist Zimbabwe recover economically. However, the ANC will not support the idea of a regime change from our neighbors. Zimbabwe has been battling decades of tough economic times fueled by massive brain drain. We're now joined by Hopewell Chin'ono, a Zimbabwean journalist, to help us make sense, or get his take on what we heard. Hopewell, good to see you, and thank you very much for availing yourself. For the purpose of somebody who did not hear those utterances, my colleague Masichaba helped us to source this bite. Let's take a look, listen at this.
We must be very much concerned about what is happening in Zimbabwe and what role we need to play to solve what is happening in Zimbabwe, because we don't subscribe to the idea of a regime change in Zimbabwe. We need to campaign very hard to get things right, because Zimbabweans are coming to our country in their numbers because something is not right in their own country, which we must support them. And once that country becomes what it was, there will be no Zimbabwean here. So the British must think very hard about what they've done, and the Americans. They must uplift the sanctions so that Zimbabwe can grow as the economy, and not use sanctions to deepen the pain and the impoverishment of Zimbabwe.
Those utterances have since attracted a lot of negative reaction. Hopewell, why?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. It is because Fikile Mbalula, the new Secretary General of the South African ruling African National Congress, does not understand the problems that are existing in Zimbabwe, or if he does, he has just decided to choose a political side, which is ZANU-PF, and it's understandable because the ANC and ZANU-PF go back a long way. The problems in Zimbabwe are rooted in the looting of public funds, which was alluded to by the former President Robert Mugabe in 2015. At one point, $15 billion alone was looted and not accounted for. Today, we have an immigration crisis in South Africa caused by Zimbabweans crossing the border illegally and going to look for jobs which are not available in Zimbabwe because ZANU-PF policies have destroyed the factory bases, they've destroyed the economy. A lot of Zimbabweans are going to South Africa today to seek medical attention. We have got 5 central hospitals in Zimbabwe. They only need $50 million. The ZANU-PF political elite smuggle gold worth $150 million to South Africa and Dubai, and what they steal in a month will run our central hospitals for 3 years. So if that money was not being stolen, Zimbabweans would not be crossing the border to go into South Africa to seek healthcare from South African systems. And the reason why the South African healthcare system is now strained is because the ANC refuses to accept that there is a problem in Zimbabwe which can be solved without even mentioning the Americans and the British, because it's about rule of law. We've had many rigged elections, and successive South African governments led by the ANC have come out to support ZANU-PF. And what Fikile Mbalula says that they are not going to support a democratic transition, it's exactly the ANC policy that has been in place for years. Thabo Mbeki refused to support a democratic transition, which is an act of democracy. Regime change happens when Zimbabweans or citizens of a country are allowed to choose a government of their own choice. So the African National Congress is saying that it will not allow Zimbabweans to choose a leadership and a government of their own choice, which is very unfortunate. And it will result in more Zimbabweans flooding into South Africa because the crisis can only continue.
You have further accused the African National Congress as well as ZANU-PF of benefiting from the movement of Zimbabweans into South Africa. How should we then understand that, right? With the current legislation, you know very well about the Zimbabwean exemption permits, the extension being next year. How should we then understand that move by the government of South Africa?
Well, the South African South African National Congress, it went below 50% for the first time in the local government elections, and it shook them. So they've been frantic to try and appease South Africans so that they can be seen as if they are doing something about the immigration crisis. But the immigration crisis in South Africa cannot be resolved by simply chasing away Zimbabweans from South Africa. It needs to be resolved at root cause, which is in Zimbabwe. If the economy in Zimbabwe is working, there's no need for Zimbabweans to be crossing into South Africa. The reason why they're crossing into South Africa is because the economy is not working. And if you look at the things that are required for the economy to work in Zimbabwe, they exist in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has got over 80 natural mineral resources, and yet those resources are being smuggled out of the country. They are being plundered by a small cabal in ZANU-PF, and the ANC knows this. That's why Zimbabweans have now reached a point where they start asking themselves whether there's any financial gain for ANC political elites in what is happening in Zimbabwe, the corrupt rule that's taking place in Zimbabwe, for the ANC to defend something that is self-evident, something that is clear. That, for instance, the biggest hospital in Zimbabwe only has one maternity theater. 2,500 Zimbabwean women are dying. And as a result, over 70% of women who go to Messina Hospital in South Africa are Zimbabwean. And there's a problem in Limpopo where citizens start attacking each other. But this is the problem created by political elites. Now, to build one maternity theater in Zimbabwe, it costs only $37,000. One Land Cruiser can build 11 maternity theaters. The Zimbabwean government has got hundreds, if not thousands, of Land Cruisers in service being used by ZANU-PF political elites. Now, that is not caused by sanctions. That is caused by misgovernance and looting of public funds.
On the notion or the mantra of sanctions, the ANC is not the only party to say the sanctions should be lifted, right? The Secretary General of the ANC went on to say, tell the British to think hard, or we'll tell the British to think hard. We're telling them to think hard. They know what they agreed to at Lancaster in reference to the Lancaster Agreement. How should we understand this mantra of sanctions against Zimbabwe? Is it sanctions against a country, or is this targeted sanctions against particular individuals? Because we are being made to understand that these sanctions are the reason why Zimbabwe is on its knees.
Well, it's a lie to say that the Zimbabwe is on its knees because of sanctions. I don't support sanctions myself because they are not effective at all. They are useless. If they were effective, ZANU-PF would have done something about them a long time ago. In fact, what's happening now is that ZANU-PF is using these sanctions to explain its grand failures in delivering public goods and public services to Zimbabwean citizens. And unfortunately, the ANC has taken the same route to defend ZANU-PF and to explain the failures by ZANU-PF to use those sanctions. These sanctions are targeted against individuals. The people that should be complaining about sanctions, it's citizens themselves, because it's citizens who face problems when they go abroad and they try to open a bank account and they are harassed because the Zimbabwean leadership is on sanctions. But the Zimbabwean leadership itself is not suffering. They are driving expensive cars. They build mansions. They are buying mansions in South Africa and in Dubai. They are smuggling gold. They are smuggling diamonds every day. So they are not affected by these sanctions. The sanctions affect the ordinary people who want to open a bank account in South Africa, and they have to wait until they are cleared that they are not on the sanctions list. If South Africa wants to do something positive for Zimbabwe and for Zimbabweans, it needs to ask its counterparts in ZANU-PF to respect the rule of law. Right now, we've got a Member of Parliament, Job Scala, an opposition Member of Parliament who has been in jail for over 6 months without trial. These are the sort of things that attract sanctions. Imagine if the ANC would put Julius Malema in prison without trial for 6 months. There will be an outrage in South Africa. And that's why there's an outrage from ordinary Zimbabweans that the ANC is supporting a rogue regime that incarcerates members of parliament, that throws journalists that expose corruption like myself into prison. I've been to prison 3 times inside 6 months for doing my work. And the ANC says nothing about this. all it does and all it cares about is making sure that ZANU-PF stays in power, like what Fikile Mbalula said when he said the ANC won't accept a transition. Now, this has a huge effect, not just on Zimbabwe, but on South Africa as well, because if Zimbabweans do not have jobs, the natural transition for them is to go to South Africa to look for jobs. And it is the South African political elites who benefit from illegal immigration because their maids are from Zimbabwe, their gardeners are from Zimbabwe, and yet they pit poor Zimbabweans and poor South Africans to fight against each other and tell South Africans that you don't have jobs because of Zimbabweans. But this is a crisis created by the ruling parties of both countries.
Today it's Zimbabweans moving from Zimbabwe to South Africa. Tomorrow it could very well be South Africans moving to Ghana, for instance, because it's about economic migration. So what do you perceive then, perhaps beyond, because you spoke of political elites pitting the everyday person on the ground against each other, what then needs to happen? What's the solution outside of the political elites? Is there?
I think the solution is for South Africans to put pressure on their government, not to support rogue regimes, for South Africans to put pressure on their government to go and do the right thing when South Africa sits in SADC, because the South African government has also come out through Cleyston Monyela, who's the head of the South African Public Diplomacy Department, to say that their policy is not that sanctions have caused the problem, it is a SADC policy. That's why we were surprised to hear the ANC now saying it's an ANC policy. And yet, just 2 months ago, Cleyston Monyela said that it was a SADC policy. South Africa is aware that the problems in Zimbabwe were created by the ruling elite in Zimbabwe. So there's a discord in terms of what they believe to be the problem in Zimbabwe. In 2015, the current chairperson of the African National Congress, Gwede Mantashe, said that the economy had been destroyed by ZANU-PF. The education minister in South Africa came out and said that it is ZANU-PF that has created a crisis. But the Secretary General, the new Secretary General of the ANC, came out and said something different. So South Africa needs to be organized. They need to come up with one policy and not to be shooting from the hip all the time.
Hopewell Chin'ono, thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon.